Rain moved softly over the dirt road leading to the old Ozark farm. Tessa Marlowe slowed beneath the sagging porch, soaked through, unsure if she should knock or turn back to the broken car waiting half a mile behind her. She wasn't lost. She was just out of places to go. All she needed was one dry room until morning. But when the door opened, she did not find the tired old farmer she had imagined, or some gray-haired widow keeping soup warm on the stove. She found a Navy SEAL home on leave. For a moment, Tessa forgot what she had come to ask. Then she stepped back and said, "I'm sorry. I think I knocked on the wrong house. I should try the place across the field." Nolan glanced toward the dark shape of the neighbor's farm. "You can," he said, "but Mr. Pruitt owns a shotgun and thinks every knock after dark is either a thief, a tax collector, or the end of the Republic." Tessa froze, too tired not to almost laugh. Behind Nolan, two unnamed puppies lifted their heads from a towel near the stove. Then he opened the door wider. "Spare rooms down the hall," he said. "House is a mess." She stepped inside to escape the rain. Neither of them knew she had just entered the one place grief had not yet learned how to defend. Before the story begins, let us know where you're watching from today. It's always beautiful to see how many places a single story can reach. Nolan Archer had been on leave for 3 days before. Anyone in Ava knew he was back. He did not return to the small white house where he had once lived with Meredith. That house sat 40 miles north, with the curtains still drawn, old mail curled inside the box by the porch, and a kitchen table he had not touched since the week after the funeral. He kept the key on his truck ring, buried between a bottle opener and a dull brass tag from his grandfather's tool shed. But he had not used it. Some doors stayed closed because opening them required more courage than walking into gunfire. So Nolan went to his grandfather's farm instead, an old place tucked beyond a dirt road outside Ava, Missouri, where the Ozark Hills rose soft and green after spring rain. Farmhouse leaned a little toward the east as if listening to the pasture. The barn had lost half its red paint to weather. The porch boards complained under every boot step, and the air smelled of wet cedar, machine oil, and the long patience of things left unused. It suited him. At 37, Nolan still moved like a man trained to waste nothing. He fixed the loose latch on the back door before he unpacked. He checked every window before dark. He ate beans from a saucepan at the kitchen counter, washed the spoon, dried it, and placed it back in the drawer as if someone might inspect the room later. No one would. Meredith's ring sat in his shirt pocket, wrapped in a square of cloth he had folded so many times the edges had gone soft. His own ring stayed there, too. Some mornings, he reached for it, before remembering he had stopped wearing it. Other mornings, he forgot to reach at all. And those were the ones that troubled him most. By late afternoon, clouds gathered over the western tree line, thick and low, turning the pasture the color of pewter. Nolan was behind the barn, clearing old feed sacks from beneath a workbench, when he heard a soft scrape near the front gate. It came once, then again, too light for the wind and too uneven for a branch. He stepped outside and listened. The old farm held its breath. Near the gate, beside a leaning cedar post, sat a wooden fruit crate with one corner cracked. Inside it lay a faded towel, a tipped plastic bowl, and 2 puppies barely old enough to make sense of their own feet. One had darker fur around the muzzle and watched him without moving. The other lifted its head, blinked hard, and promptly slid sideways against its littermate. Nolan stood there for a moment, rain beginning to tick against the brim of the gate. "Well," he muttered, "that's poor planning." The darker puppy stared at him, as if waiting for a better answer. He crouched slowly, giving them time to decide whether his hands meant trouble. They smelled of dust, old milk, and damp towel, but they were warm when he lifted them. The smaller one made a protesting sound no bigger than a hiccup. The quiet one pressed its nose against his wrist and stayed still. Nolan carried them to the kitchen before the first real sheet of rain crossed the pasture. He spread an old towel near the stove, warmed milk in a small pan, and found a dropper in his grandfather's cracked medicine cabinet. It took patience, and Nolan had always trusted work that demanded patience. The restless puppy drank with clumsy greed. The quieter one needed more time, watching Nolan's hand between every swallow. "You two are temporary," he said. The words sounded thin in the kitchen. He found another towel and rubbed them dry, careful around their ears, careful around their small ribs, careful in a way he had not meant to be. The rain strengthened against the roof. Water ran from the porch gutter in a steady silver rope, and the farmhouse settled around him, with its old joints popping in the damp. For a few hours, the place almost felt occupied. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, so soft Nolan thought it might be the loose shutter near the front room. He looked toward the hall, waited, and heard it again. 3 uneven taps. Not forceful, not confident. The kind of knock made by someone already preparing to apologize. Nolan turned off the stove. The puppies stirred on the towel. He crossed the hall without rushing, his hand pausing near the old umbrella stand where his grandfather used to keep a hickory walking stick. Habit brought the pause. Discipline kept him from picking it up. When he opened the door, rain blew across the porch boards. A woman stood beneath the sagging roof, one hand gripping the strap of a worn canvas bag. Her denim jacket darkened at the shoulders. She looked early 30s, tired in the way people looked after holding themselves together too long. Wet strands of brown hair clung near her cheek, and her shoes were muddy from the road. She stared at him. Whatever she had expected behind the door, it had not been a Navy SEAL home on leave. For 1 second, the rain did all the talking. "My car broke down," she said finally, "about half a mile back. I'm sorry. I was hoping I could wait somewhere dry until morning." Nolan glanced past her toward the road, though the bend had already disappeared into rain and trees. "You walked from the low-water crossing?" "I didn't know it had a name." "It has several. Most of them aren't polite." Her mouth moved, like she almost smiled, then thought better of it. Inside the kitchen, the restless puppy gave a small squeak. The woman looked over Nolan's shoulder before she could stop herself. Her eyes found the towel by the stove, the 2 tiny heads, the saucepan on the counter. Something in her face changed, not dramatically, only enough for Nolan to notice. Then she stepped back. "I'm sorry," she said. "I think I knocked on the wrong house. I saw another place across the field. I should try there." Nolan looked toward the dark line of trees where Edwin Pruitt's farmhouse sat beyond the pasture. A light burned in one upstairs window. Somewhere in that house, Pruitt was probably sitting in a recliner with the weather radio turned up, waiting for the government or the end times to make the first move. "You can," Nolan said, "but Mr. Pruitt owns a shotgun and thinks every knock after dark is either a thief, a tax collector, or the end of the republic." The woman stopped on the first step. Rain dripped from the porch roof between them. She looked too exhausted to laugh properly, but a small breath escaped her anyway. It softened the sharpness of the moment. Nolan opened the door wider and stepped back. "Spare rooms down the hall," he said. "Blankets are in the cedar trunk. Bathroom door sticks. Kitchen's on the left." She hesitated. "Are you sure?" "No." That time, she did smile. "My name is Tessa," she said. "Tessa Marlowe, Nolan Archer." He gave the name plainly, then moved aside as she stepped into the hall. She stood there dripping onto the rug, trying to take up as little space as possible. People who had been unwanted before often did that. Nolan noticed because he knew the shape of it, even if his version wore a different coat. Tessa looked toward the kitchen. "Are they yours for tonight?" That sounds like something a man says before he gets attached. Nolan picked up a towel from the chair and handed it to her. "That sounds like something a nurse says." Her fingers tightened around the cloth. "I used to be," He heard the past tense and let it pass without question. The rain pressed harder against the windows, filling the old farmhouse with a steady, enclosing sound. Tessa took the towel, wiped her face, and looked down the hallway toward the spare room. Nolan did not offer to carry her bag. He did not ask why she had been driving alone through the Ozarks with no place waiting for her. He only pointed toward the door that stuck in the trunk with the blankets. It was not warmth exactly, it was room. By the time Tessa returned from the hallway, the puppies had settled near the stove again. The quieter one slept with its chin tucked against the other's back. The restless one twitched in a dream, paws shifting as if chasing something across a field it had not yet seen. Tessa stood in the kitchen doorway, damp hair loose around her face. "They'll need feeding again before dawn," she said softly. Nolan looked at her. "You know that? I know small things don't stay well by accident." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away first. Outside, rain covered the old fields, the broken car, the road, back to everywhere Tessa had already lost. Inside, 2 unnamed puppies slept near the stove while a woman without a destination and a man avoiding his own home listened to the farmhouse breathe around them. The night had only offered shelter. Already, it was asking for more. Before we see whether Tessa leaves the farm or finds a reason to stay, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Tessa woke to the sound of wet birds calling from the trees beyond the kitchen window. For a few seconds, she did not remember where she was. The ceiling above her was low and cracked. Near one corner, the quilt over her knees smelled faintly of cedar, and rainwater tapped from the gutter outside in slow, uneven drops. Then the night came back in pieces. The dead Honda on the road, the porch light, Nolan Archer opening the door, the 2 puppies sleeping near the stove. The house was quiet. She folded the quilt, placed it at the foot of the narrow bed, and stepped into the hall with her shoes in one hand. Floorboards gave her away at once. In the kitchen, the puppies were awake on their towel, one sitting solemnly beside the stove, the other trying to chew the edge of the towel with the determination of a creature fighting a great family enemy. Nolan was gone. Tessa found a note on the counter, written in block letters on the back of an old receipt. "Went to look at your car. Coffee's in the pot. Don't let the small one eat the towel." She read it twice, then looked at the smaller puppy, who had already made several poor decisions. Outside, the morning smelled of soaked grass and red clay. Mist hung low across the pasture, catching in the fence wire and softening the shape of the barn. Tessa followed the dirt road, back toward the bend, her borrowed jacket pulled tight around her, each step making the mud sigh beneath her shoes. She saw Nolan before he saw her. Her Honda sat where she had left it, crooked near the shoulder, one tire half in the weeds. Nolan lay half under the front end, boots planted in the mud, one sleeve pushed above his elbow. A metal toolbox sat open beside him, old and dented, the kind a man inherited rather than bought. Tessa stopped a few yards away. "You didn't have to do that." Nolan slid out from under the car and wiped his hand on a rag. "You were planning to sleep in it?" "No." "Then I had to look." She had no ready answer for that which seemed to satisfy him. He stood and nodded toward the open hood. Upper radiator hoses cracked. Thermostat sticking. Belt slipped after coolant sprayed across it. "I can patch enough to keep it from getting worse, but it needs parts." "How long?" "If Springfield has them in stock, 3 days. 4 if the delivery driver hates gravel roads." Tessa looked at the engine as if it had betrayed her personally. The Honda had carried her through 5 years of hospital shifts, 2 apartments, 1 broken lease, and the long week after the layoffs when she kept driving because stopping made everything real. Now it sat steaming gently in a ditch like an old mule with a grudge. "I can pay you," she said. Nolan closed the hood halfway. "I didn't quote a price." "I know. That makes it worse." For a moment, his mouth moved like he might smile. "I'm on leave. Turns out doing nothing is harder than fixing a car. The line should have sounded dismissive. Instead, Tessa heard the tiredness under it, the kind that came from a man who trusted motion because stillness let too much speak. They walked back to the farmhouse without hurrying. Nolan carried the toolbox. Tessa carried the rag because she needed something to do with her hands. The clouds were breaking over the tree line, and sunlight came through in pale strips, turning the wet fields silver in places. In the kitchen, the puppies greeted them as if they had returned from war. The quieter one sat back and watched, head tilted. The smaller one launched itself forward, tripped over the towel, and rolled against Nolan's boot with no shame at all. Nolan looked down at it. "You're going to be a problem." Tessa crouched near them. "What are their names?" "They don't have names." "Why?" Nolan opened the cabinet for a mug. "Names make things harder to hand over." Tessa rubbed her thumb along the quieter puppy's head. It did not push into her hand, yet it did not pull away. It stayed grounded, patient, dark eyes following everything. "This one feels like moss," she said. Nolan glanced back. "Moss? It's quiet. Stays close to the ground. It survives rain." The puppy blinked once, accepting the ceremony with grave dignity. The smaller one had discovered Nolan's bootlace and was attacking it with bright, useless courage. Tessa watched it tug, lose balance, recover, and immediately try again. "And this one is Lark." Nolan looked down as the puppy sneezed against his boot. "That thing?" "Lark," she repeated. "Like a little morning bird that doesn't know the world is tired yet." Nolan stared at the puppy for another second. "He's chewing my lace. He's expressing hope. He's expressing dental ambition." Tessa laughed before she could stop herself. It startled the kitchen, small but real. And for half a breath, Nolan looked at her as if the sound had moved something he had left nailed shut. The next days arranged themselves around small tasks. Tessa cleaned the corner near the stove and made it a proper space for Moss and Lark, with folded towels, a shallow dish, and a paper schedule taped to the cabinet. She wrote feeding times in neat lines, marked how much each puppy drank, and circled the hours when Lark seemed determined to turn every object into a personal challenge. She found clean cloths in the laundry room, washed them twice, and stacked them by size. Moss learned the schedule faster than any of them expected. He sat near Tessa whenever she warmed milk, watching her hands with the solemn focus of a courthouse clerk. Lark preferred chaos. He chased the rag Nolan used for oil, slipped on the kitchen floor, then looked offended that the floor had behaved that way. Nolan worked on the Honda each morning, then returned to the farm and fixed whatever demanded attention next. He replaced the loose hinge on the back gate, patched a leak along the shed roof, and cleared wet leaves from the porch gutter while thunder muttered beyond the hills. He did not talk much while he worked, but he listened when Tessa spoke to the puppies. She never cooed over them as if they were toys. She checked their paws, cleaned a tiny scrape on Lark's hind leg, warmed the milk to the same careful temperature each time, and spoke to Moss in the steady voice of someone who had spent years telling frightened people what would happen before it happened. Nolan recognized discipline when he saw it even wrapped in gentleness. That recognition unsettled him. By the third evening, the farmhouse had changed in ways too small for a stranger to notice. A clean towel hung beside the sink. The coffee pot was washed before dark. The puppies no longer cried when rain hit the windows. Nolan still checked the locks, but now Tessa waited until he finished before turning down the kitchen lamp, as if she had accepted that some habits were less about fear than survival. For a few days, the broken car gave them all an excuse to stay near the same fire. Then, late on the fourth afternoon, a figure appeared near the fence line. Edwin Pruitt stood beyond the pasture gate in a faded canvas coat, one hand resting near the crook of a lowered shotgun. His gray beard was trimmed square, his hat sat low, and his eyes moved from Nolan to the farmhouse porch, where Tessa had come out with a towel folded over one arm. "Afternoon," Pruitt called. Nolan walked to the fence. Edwin saw lights on more than usual. "They work when you flip the switch." Pruitt's eyes narrowed. "That your explanation?" "For the lights, yes." The old man looked toward Tessa again, not rudely, but with the suspicion of someone who had lived long enough to know trouble often arrived sounding polite. "Who's the woman?" Nolan did not turn around. "Car broke down. She's here until it's fixed." "That all?" "That's all." Tessa heard every word from the porch. She told herself she was grateful for the answer, because it was true and clean and did not dress anything up. Still, the towel in her hands felt suddenly unnecessary. Moss pressed against her ankle. Lark was somewhere behind her, wrestling a corner of the doormat. The farm had begun to feel less empty. Yet Nolan's words reminded her that empty places could make room for a person, without promising they belonged there. After Edwin Pruitt left the fence line, the farm seemed to hold his question in the air for a while. Tessa stayed on the porch with the folded towel in her hands, watching the old man cross the pasture with his shotgun tucked low and his shoulders set against the damp wind. Nolan remained by the gate until Pruitt disappeared behind the trees, then turned back toward the house without offering any explanation. The answer he had given was true, clean, and practical. She was there until the car was fixed. That should have been enough. By morning, the rain had moved east, leaving the Ozark fields bright and wet beneath a low white sky. Grass rose fast along the fence posts, green enough to look almost new, and the puddles in the ruts held broken pieces of sunlight. The air felt warmer, heavy with damp soil, cedar, and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle somewhere beyond the barn. Tessa began to notice Nolan in pieces. He sat with his back near a wall and his face toward the door, even when he drank coffee alone. He checked the locks after sunset in the same order, each night: front door, kitchen window, mudroom latch, back door, then the small window over the sink. When a truck passed too slowly on the road, his hand went still around whatever tool he was holding until the sound faded. He never looked frightened. That somehow made it sadder. Moss and Lark filled the house with smaller emergencies. Moss learned to wait beside the stove when Tessa warmed milk, watching her as though she were teaching a sacred procedure. Lark believed every shoelace, towel corner, and loose button had been placed on earth for his personal development. Once, he dragged Nolan's oil rag halfway across the kitchen, then sat on it proudly, as if he had secured enemy territory. Nolan looked down at him. "That is not yours," Lark sneezed. Tessa said, "He disagrees on legal grounds." Nolan almost smiled. For a few quiet days, the broken Honda gave them a schedule. Nolan worked on the engine in the morning, came back with dirt on his sleeves and a new part of the problem solved, then turned his attention to the farm. Tessa cleaned what she could without making the house feel invaded, washed the puppy towels, opened windows when the sun came through, and learned which floorboards complained loudest after dark. Something in the farmhouse began to shift. It did not become warm all at once. Warmth did not return to places like that by command. It came slowly, in the smell of coffee before noon, in Moss sleeping with his chin on Tessa's shoe, in Lark tumbling under a chair and looking offended when the chair refused to apologize. One afternoon, a hard shower swept in without warning. The rain blew sideways across the porch and pushed through a cracked front window before Tessa could get it shut. She grabbed an old towel from the mudroom and hurried into the front room, where water had streaked the sill and dripped onto a narrow shelf beneath it. The room smelled of dust, paper, and damp wood. As she wiped the sill, a thin book slipped from the shelf and fell open at her feet. It was an old repair manual, the cover oil-stained and soft at the corners. A few pages had handwritten notes in the margins, part numbers, measurements, short reminders written in two different hands. Tessa bent to pick it up, meaning only to place it back where it belonged. Then she saw the photograph. It had been tucked between two pages near the middle of the manual, protected there by accident or intention. In it, Nolan stood on the porch of the same farmhouse years earlier, younger in a way that had nothing to do with age. Beside him stood a woman with brown hair lifted by the wind, one hand resting on the porch rail, the other hooked loosely through his arm. They were not posing perfectly. They looked interrupted by laughter. Tessa turned the photograph over before she could think better of it. For Nolan, so the old place remembers us kindly. Meredith, a small folded program rested behind the picture, cream-colored, worn along the crease. Tessa saw Meredith Archer's name, the dates beneath it, and nothing more before she closed it gently. The rain tapped against the glass. Tessa stood very still. She had seen grief before, in hospital rooms, in waiting areas, in the faces of husbands who kept asking nurses questions after the doctor had already answered them. She knew the strange privacy of loss. People carried it in shirt pockets, in old voicemails, in recipes never made again, in photographs hidden inside things that were supposed to be practical. She placed the program behind the photograph exactly as she had found it. Then, she slid both back into the manual, closed the cover, and set the book on the shelf with its spine facing out. When Nolan came in that evening, the rain had stopped. Tessa poured coffee into his mug without asking if he wanted it. He noticed the cup, then the shelf in the front room, then the repair manual sitting straighter than before. For a moment, his face changed so slightly that another person might have missed it. He said nothing. She said nothing, too. Some kindness had to stay quiet long enough to remain kind. The parts arrived the next morning in a cardboard box left at the end of the dirt road by a delivery driver who refused to test the last stretch after rain. Nolan walked out to get it, came back with the box under one arm, and spent the day bent over the Honda with a patience that looked almost like anger from a distance. By late afternoon, the engine turned over cleanly. No steam rose from under the hood. No belt screamed. Tessa stood beside the driver's door and pressed her hand lightly against the roof. "So that's it," she said. Nolan wiped his hands on a rag. "Should get you to Springfield, farther if the car feels generous." She nodded. The words, "thank you," felt too small, and everything larger seemed dangerous. Inside the farmhouse, she packed the canvas bag she had carried through the rain. It took less than 5 minutes. That embarrassed her more than she expected. How quickly a life could fit into cloth when no place had claimed it for long. Moss followed her from the spare room to the kitchen, silent and watchful. Lark tried to climb into the bag twice, failed both times, and seemed personally wounded by the physics involved. At the car, Tessa opened the passenger door and set the bag inside. The late sun had broken through the clouds, laying gold across the wet hood and the grass beyond the fence. Nolan stood near the front bumper with his hands at his sides, looking at the vehicle as if he had repaired a machine and accidentally fixed nothing. "I should go before dark," Tessa said. "That road washes bad after evening rain." "I know, you don't, actually." That made her look at him. His voice had not softened, but something under it had shifted. Moss reached her first. He placed both front paws on her shoe and caught the hem of her pants gently between his teeth. He did not tug hard. He only held on. Tessa looked down. "Moss." Lark chose a more direct argument. He scrambled into the open passenger side, climbed over her canvas bag, and sat on it with grave commitment. Then he licked the window. Nolan stared at him. Tessa stared too. For the first time all day, she laughed, but it shook at the edges. Nolan rubbed one hand over the back of his neck. "I'm due back in a week." Tessa turned toward him. "The farm's been empty a long time," he said. That was manageable when it was only dust and bad plumbing. Now there are 2 small idiots who think the kitchen is home. Lark sneezed against the glass again, as if supporting the statement. Nolan kept his eyes on the car. I don't want to put them in a shelter if I don't have to. Tessa's smile faded into something quieter. You're asking me to stay? I'm asking if you need somewhere to be for a while. He paused. And if you can keep them from eating the house. She looked toward the porch, the towel by the stove visible through the screen door. The wet fields beyond the barn, the road that had not given her any answer except distance. Staying scared her. Leaving did too. Only one of those fears had Moss at her feet, and Lark guarding her bag like a ridiculous little king. Nolan glanced toward Pruitt's place beyond the trees. I could ask Edwin. Tessa looked at him. He means well, Nolan said. But he'd name them after Civil War generals and make them listen to the weather radio all day. Tessa let out a breath that almost became a laugh. Her eyes stung before she could stop them. She looked down at Moss, who still held her pant leg as if the fate of the entire farm depended on his small jaw. In the car, Lark sat taller on the bag. The whole place waited, and this time, so did she. Tessa did not answer Nolan right away. She looked at Moss, still holding the hem of her pants, with the solemn determination of a creature who believed small teeth could stop the world from changing. Then she looked at Lark, planted on her canvas bag in the passenger seat, his ears uneven, his face bright with the confidence of someone who had made an excellent legal claim. Nolan stood beside the repaired Honda, with grease on his knuckles, and the careful stillness of a man trying not to ask for too much. I can stay for the week, she said at last. Nolan nodded once, as if she had agreed to check a fence line or watch a pot on the stove. That'll help. But his hand loosened around the rag. The next morning, the farm began teaching Tessa its small rules. Nolan showed her the breaker panel in the mudroom, where 2 faded labels had been written in his grandfather's square handwriting, and 3 others had been corrected in Nolan's. He showed her which lock on the storage shed needed to be lifted before it turned, how to check the propane gauge beside the back wall, and where the weather radio sat on the shelf above the pantry. He spoke plainly, moving from one thing to the next without ceremony. But every instruction carried the shape of concern. If the radio says flash flood warning, you don't drive the low road, he said. If the lights go out, breaker first, generator second. If somebody comes up the back way after dark, you don't go outside to be polite. Tessa folded her arms. Do I look like someone who goes outside to be polite? You look like someone who apologizes when furniture gets in her way. She tried not to smile. That chair was very aggressive. It's been that way since 1989. Behind them, Lark crashed into the leg of the kitchen table, sat down, and blinked as if the table had betrayed him. Moss watched from beside the stove, calm and mildly disappointed in everyone. The week moved in practical pieces. Tessa taped a fresh feeding schedule inside the cabinet door and made separate stacks for clean towels, dirty towels, and towels Lark had personally insulted beyond repair. She planted basil and mint in 2 chipped clay pots near the kitchen steps, pressing the soil down with her thumbs while Moss sat nearby like a tiny inspector. Lark dug one paw into the loose dirt, sneezed, and looked so pleased with himself that Tessa had to turn away before Nolan saw her laughing. Nolan repaired the barn door track, tightened the porch rail, and tested the old mechanical alarm he had rigged years earlier from a pulley, a bell, and a length of wire running toward Pruitt's side fence. It gave a harsh iron clang when pulled from the shed. Pruitt heard it and shouted from somewhere beyond the trees that if the government had finally invaded, Nolan owed him 20 minutes to put on better boots. That's the alarm? Tessa asked. That's Pruitt's version of yes. She glanced toward the fence line. He always like that? On good days. The first thunderstorm came on Thursday afternoon, rolling over the hills in slow gray waves. Moss pressed himself under the kitchen table before the first close rumble. Lark tried to bark at the thunder, lost his nerve halfway through, and climbed into Tessa's lap, with both paws caught in her sleeve. Tessa sat on the floor beneath the table with them, speaking in the even voice she had used through power outages, bad test results, and night shifts when fear made people sharper than they meant to be. She told Moss the thunder was only weather moving furniture upstairs. She told Lark that bravery did not require yelling at the sky. Nolan stood near the stove with a mug in his hand, listening as if the room had grown a second heartbeat. Something in the farm had started to warm. That was what made it dangerous. Nolan packed his duffel in the spare bedroom that evening. He folded 2 shirts, checked a small flashlight, rolled socks into tight pairs, and placed everything where it belonged. The order helped. It always had. Yet each time he passed the kitchen, he saw Tessa rinsing a bottle at the sink, Moss asleep on her shoe, Lark dragging a washcloth backward through the room with the triumph of a parade marshal. He told himself she was staying because the situation required it. He told himself the puppies were the reason. Then Tessa reached up to tuck loose hair behind her ear with one wrist because her hands were wet, and Nolan had to look away from the quiet life forming in his grandfather's kitchen as if it were something bright enough to burn. That night, his phone rang after 10. Tessa was at the table, writing the next feeding, times when Nolan stepped onto the porch to answer. She heard only pieces through the screen door. Virginia, instructor injury, short notice, report by Sunday night. His voice stayed calm, but she saw the change in his shoulders before he came back inside. "I have to leave early," he said. "How early? Tomorrow." The pencil stopped in her hand. The storm had cleared, leaving the night wet and black beyond the windows. Frogs called from the ditch near the road. Somewhere in the house, the old refrigerator kicked on with a low rattle, ordinary and rude against the silence. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Training support. Maritime interdiction. One of their instructors got hurt, and they need someone who has run the course before." Dangerous? Not like you're thinking. That did not answer everything, but Tessa had spent enough years around tired men avoiding hospital beds to know when a partial answer was the honest one available. Morning came pale and humid. Nolan moved through the house before sunrise, checking things he had already checked twice. He left a list on the counter with Pruitt's number, the sheriff's non-emergency line, the parts store in town, and a note about the back gate swelling after rain. He showed Tessa the barn alarm one more time, then the pepper spray in the mudroom drawer, then the spare key under the loose brick by the porch step. "You don't try to be brave alone," he said. Tessa looked at him. That an order? Advice from somebody who learned it late. The answer settled between them. He loaded the duffel into his truck while Moss and Lark circled his boots, sensing the shape of departure without understanding it. Lark grabbed the cuff of Nolan's pants and shook it with all the authority his small body could gather. Moss simply sat in front of the driver's door. Nolan crouched. "You listen to her," he said, touching Moss first, then Lark. "Both of you." Lark licked his thumb. Moss kept his eyes on Nolan's face. Tessa stood beneath the walnut tree, arms folded, trying to look like someone who knew what to do with goodbyes. Nolan walked back to her and stopped a few feet away. The truck idled behind him, low and steady. "If anything feels wrong, call me," he said. "If I don't answer, call Pruitt. If you can't call, pull the barn alarm. Any order you need. I heard you the first 3 times." "Good." He almost said something else. She saw it rise and stop. Then he nodded, got into the truck, and started down the dirt road. Moss and Lark ran after him. They made it only to the first bend before Nolan braked, opened the door, and stepped out into the warm morning haze. He crouched in the road while the 2 puppies reached him, one tumbling into his boot, the other sitting close enough to touch his knee. "I'll be back soon," he said. Tessa heard it from beneath the walnut tree, and somehow she knew he was not only telling them. For the first few days after Nolan left, Tessa kept listening for the sound of his truck. She heard it in the wind moving through the walnut trees, in the low groan of the porch boards after sunset, in the far-off rattle of farm equipment passing on the county road. Each time Moss lifted his head first, and Lark followed a second later, with more hope than evidence. Each time the road remained empty. By the end of the first week, the farm had found a different rhythm. Tessa fed Moss and Lark before the sun cleared the eastern fence, swept the porch after the dew lifted, checked the locks at night in the order Nolan had shown her, and learned which cabinet stuck unless she pushed it with her hip. She patched a tear in the front room curtain, stacked puppy towels beside the sink, sorted cans of feed in the pantry, and collected the mail from the roadside box with Moss trotting beside her like an unpaid deputy. Lark had no interest in law enforcement. He preferred stealing clothespins. Nolan called when he could, usually late, his voice rough with fatigue and bad reception. The course in Virginia had stretched longer than expected after another instructor went down with a knee injury, and what should have been a week became 2, then 3, then almost a month. He never complained. He only asked about the generator, the low road after rain, Pruitt's temper, and whether Lark had eaten anything expensive. "Only half a dish towel," Tessa said once. "That's progress. I didn't say which half." There was a pause on the line. Then the smallest sound from Nolan, not quite a laugh, but close enough to make the kitchen feel warmer after she hung up. In town, people began noticing her. At the feed store, a woman behind the counter asked if she was the nurse staying at Archer's old place, the words gentle on the surface and sharp underneath. At the post office, an older man told her Nolan had always been private, as if privacy were an illness she might catch if she stood too close. Tessa answered every question the way she had answered frightened families at the hospital, calmly, without giving people more than they had earned. She was not the owner of the farm, but she had stopped moving through it like a visitor. The change came quietly enough that Tessa almost trusted it. Then one storm-heavy night, the farm asked whether her staying had meant anything at all. She woke to Moss growling, not barking, not whining, growling low enough that the sound seemed to come from under the floorboards. Tessa opened her eyes in the dark spare room. For a moment, she thought thunder had pulled him from sleep, but the house was too still between the rolls of rain. Lark stood on the edge of the bed, licking her cheek with urgent little strokes, his whole body trembling with effort rather than fear. "I'm up," she whispered. Moss stood near the door, stiff from nose to tail. The cicadas outside had gone silent. That was the first thing Tessa noticed once her mind cleared. All week, their noise had filled the night like an engine in the trees. But now there was only rain, wind, and the faint tick of water from the gutter. Then the motion light near the shed blinked through the curtain. On, off, on again. Tessa slipped from the bed and moved to the window. Beyond the glass, the yard lay black and wet, the shed a darker shape against the field. Near the side gate, something metal tapped once, paused, then tapped again. A smell came through the old window frame, carried by the damp air. Cigarette smoke and motor oil. Her phone sat on the dresser with one weak bar flickering in and out. She tried Nolan first because her hand moved before pride could interfere. The call spun, failed, and returned her to the dim screen. She tried Pruitt. Nothing. The storm had swallowed the signal. The barn alarm was outside, in the shed. Tessa looked at Moss, then at Lark. "No hero nonsense," she whispered, using Dr. Carter's old phrase from her hospital days, before realizing it had come from some other life entirely. "That includes both of you." She led them to the small storage room off the kitchen, the one with a latch Nolan had repaired during his last morning. Moss resisted for half a second, eyes fixed toward the back door, but Tessa crouched and touched his chest. "Stay safe first," she said. He went in. Lark followed, only because Moss did, then immediately tried to turn around. Tessa set a folded towel inside, closed the door, and slid the latch into place. 2 seconds later, Lark complained from the other side with great moral conviction. At least they were safe. Tessa moved through the kitchen without turning on a light. She took the pepper spray from the mudroom drawer, slipped Nolan's small flashlight into her pocket, and lifted the loop of tin cans she had hung near the back hall after one of Nolan's safety lectures. Outside, rain hammered the roof hard enough to cover her footsteps. A low voice drifted from the direction of the shed. "Generator's in there." Another voice answered, closer to the porch. "Get the copper, too." Tessa's mouth went dry. The men were not inside the house. That mattered. The shed sat 20 yards from the kitchen door, and the alarm pole was mounted just inside its side entrance. If she could reach it, Pruitt would hear the bell across the field, even through rain. If she ran straight, they would see her. So she made the house lie for her. She pulled the kitchen lamp cord once, letting the light flash and die, then dropped the tin cans near the front hall. The crash rang through the house. A shadow outside the rear window jerked toward the sound. What was that? Tessa slipped through the mudroom door and into the rain. Cold water hit her face, her neck, her hands. She kept low along the side of the house, boots sinking into soft ground. The shed was ahead, its door cracked open, a narrow line of light moving inside where someone held a flashlight. A man stepped onto the back porch behind her. She heard the board creak. Tessa turned just enough to see his shape through the rain, broad cap, dark jacket, one hand braced against the post. He had not seen her fully, not yet. She raised the pepper spray and waited until he took one more step. Then she fired. He shouted, one hand flying to his face, stumbling back into the porch rail. Tessa did not wait to see more. She ran for the shed, mud sliding beneath her feet, rain blinding her, breath tearing in her chest. The second man cursed from inside. Tessa reached the side entrance, caught the alarm rope with both hands, and pulled. The bell answered with a harsh iron clang. Once, twice. Then, again and again, cutting through the storm like an old church bell dragged out of sleep. The man inside the shed dropped something heavy. It hit the floor with a metallic crash. Tessa backed away, pepper spray raised, knees shaking so hard she could feel them through her soaked jeans. A beam of white light swept across the yard. "Hey!" Pruitt's voice split the rain. "Step away from that shed." He came through the gate in a raincoat, thrown over pajamas, boots unlaced, shotgun held low and pointed at the ground. He looked furious, half-dressed and entirely awake. The kind of sight that could make a criminal reconsider the direction of his life. The two men ran. One bolted past the shed toward the road. The other stumbled off the porch, coughing, and followed. Pruitt did not fire. He only kept the light on them until the dark swallowed both shapes beyond the trees. Then the farm went quiet again, except for the bell still swinging, slower now. Tessa stood beside the shed, soaked through, pepper spray clenched in one hand, the alarm rope still tangled around the other. Her body had not asked permission before it began to shake. Pruitt reached her and lowered the flashlight. "You hit?" She shook her head. "You sure?" She nodded, then had to put one hand against the shed wall because the ground seemed to tilt. Pruitt looked toward the house. Dogs, storage room, behind the kitchen. Latched, he gave one short nod, and something in his face changed. Inside, Moss and Lark were barking with enough outrage to defend the whole state from behind the door. When Tessa opened it, Moss pressed against her legs first, solid and warm, while Lark tried to climb her shin and scold her at the same time. She sat on the kitchen floor with both of them against her, wet hair dripping onto her sleeves, breath finally breaking apart. Pruitt stood in the doorway, rain running from the brim of his hat. "I'm calling Nolan." "No," Tessa said. The word came out stronger than she felt. Pruitt frowned. "He ought to know. He will. Just not tonight." She looked down at Moss, then at Lark, both safe, both breathing, both alive in the yellow kitchen light. He needs to finish what he was called to do. I'm safe. The house is standing. They're okay. Pruitt studied her for a long moment. The old suspicion was gone from his eyes, though the grumpiness remained. Maybe that was permanent. Finally, he nodded. I'll call the sheriff first. That's fair. And I'm sleeping in my chair facing your driveway. That sounds uncomfortable. Good. Keeps a man honest. For the first time that night, Tessa almost smiled. Pruitt stepped back into the rain, and Tessa stayed on the kitchen floor with Moss and Lark pressed close. The bell outside had stopped swinging. The storm moved east across the fields. Somewhere beyond the wet road and the broken dark, Nolan was still away, trusting a house that had once been empty to hold. Tessa rested her hand on Moss's head, then on Lark's. For the first time, she understood she had not only been given shelter, she had been trusted with it. Nolan came back on a Tuesday afternoon, after a morning rain had left the fields shining. He stopped the truck outside the gate and let the engine idle longer than he needed to. The farm before him had not become a different place. The barn still leaned a little. The pasture fence still needed work. And the old porch still held its tired angle beneath the roofline. Yet something had changed in the way the place received the light. The porch had been swept clean. A fresh white stripe marked the shed door where the latch stuck in wet weather. Small towels hung from the line behind the kitchen, moving gently in the early summer air. Near the steps, the basil and mint Tessa had planted still lived in their chipped clay pots, brave and green despite the heat. Nolan turned off the engine. For a moment, he sat there with both hands on the wheel, listening to the silence after travel. He had spent the last month in Virginia measuring time by briefings, drills, tide charts, and phone calls that always ended before he was ready. He had told himself the farm was only a place he had left in responsible hands. Then Moss and Lark came running. They reached the gate and stopped as if they had rehearsed it. Moss stood tall, chest forward, eyes steady. Lark stood beside him for nearly 2 seconds before his whole body began wagging hard enough to disturb his balance. Nolan opened the truck door. "Look at you two," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he expected. He crouched in the dirt by the gate. Moss pressed his head under Nolan's hand, solid and warm, no longer the solemn scrap from the fruit crate. Lark pushed in from the side, licked Nolan's wrist, then tried to climb into his lap as if rank meant nothing in this household. "Good boys," Nolan whispered. On the porch, Tessa stood with one hand resting against the screen door. She did not run to it. She did not perform relief for the sake of making the moment easier. She simply watched him with tired eyes, sun on her shoulder, and the quiet steadiness of someone who had kept a promise through more than one long night. "You made it back," she said. "Looks like you did too." Her smile was small, mostly. Before Nolan could ask what that meant, Pruitt came through the side gate with a thermos in one hand and irritation in his stride. His boots were muddy, his hat was crooked, and he looked pleased with himself in a way he would have denied under oath. "About time," Pruitt said. Nolan stood. "Good to see you too." "I didn't say it was good. I said it was time." Tessa looked down, hiding a smile. Pruitt told him about the storm night after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with his thermos between both hands. He did not dress it up. 2 men had come for the generator, copper, and fuel. Tessa had secured the pups, tried the phone, used the house to distract them, reached the shed alarm, and held together until help arrived. Nolan listened without moving much. When Pruitt finished, the old man pointed finger toward him. "She didn't call you because she thought your work mattered. I told her you'd want to know. She told me to call the sheriff first. Woman has nerve." Tessa set a plate in the sink. "I was standing right there, Mr. Pruitt." "I know. That's why I said it clean." After Pruitt left, the evening settled around the porch in a slow blue haze. Crickets started under the fence line. Moss lay across Nolan's boot, while Lark slept sideways on the step with one paw in the air, exhausted from welcoming and from being himself. Nolan sat beside Tessa on the porch boards. "You should have called," he said. "I tried after." She looked at the field. "You were where you were supposed to be. I was safe by then. That wasn't yours to decide alone." "No," she said quietly. "But the house was in my care, so were Moss and Lark. I made the best choice I could with the night I had." Nolan wanted to argue. The habit rose in him, sharp and protective. Then he looked at the clean porch, the repaired latch, the two sleeping dogs, and the woman beside him, who had not asked to become the steady part of his absence. He let the argument go. For a while, they spoke about small things because large things waited without mercy. The shed door, the sheriff's report, Lark's ongoing war against clothespins, Pruitt sleeping in his recliner, facing the driveway for 3 nights, with the shotgun across his knees, and the weather radio, muttering like an old prophet. Then Tessa grew quiet. "I saw the photograph," she said. Nolan did not look at her. Tessa folded her hands together. "I didn't mean to. It fell from the repair manual during that rainstorm. I put it back. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how." The porch seemed to deepen around them. "You don't have to tell me anything," she added. "But I don't want to keep walking around it like a broken chair in the middle of a room." Nolan breathed out once, slowly. "Meredith loved the old house," he said. "Our house, not this farm, the one north of here." Tessa waited. She liked the morning light in the kitchen, said it made even cheap coffee look holy. He rubbed his thumb along the seam of his jeans. "After she died, I locked the door and never went back inside. Everything was still where she left it. Her mug, her book by the couch, a grocery list on the fridge." Moss lifted his head and rested his chin on Nolan's boot. Nolan swallowed. "I could handle dangerous places. I couldn't handle that kitchen." Tessa did not offer a bright answer. She only sat beside him while the first stars came through the damp air. "Some people who leave us still deserve a place in the light," she said. "Even if the living need time to open the curtains." Nolan closed his eyes for a moment. A few days later, he drove Tessa, Moss, and Lark to the small white house north of Ava. The grass had grown high around the front walk. The mailbox leaned toward the ditch. Dust filmed the windows, and a vine had climbed halfway up one porch post, as if the house had been trying to cover its own face. Nolan stood at the door with the key in his hand until Lark gave a soft sound near his boot. The lock resisted twice before it turned. Inside, the air smelled closed and old, but not angry. Nolan opened the curtains in the living room, one by one, letting light enter in pale rectangles across the floor. Tessa stayed near the doorway, holding a folded piece of clean cloth, while Moss sat beside her, and Lark sniffed the rug with great professional interest. Nolan placed Meredith's photograph in a new cedar box. Tessa had lined it with the cloth. He added the funeral program, the note from the back of the picture, and the ring he had carried in his shirt pocket for too long. Then he set the box on a shelf near the window, where morning light would find it. It was not goodbye. It was mercy. By the end of that week, Tessa had taken part-time work at a small veterinary clinic in town, answering phones, cleaning exam rooms, and learning how to help patients who could not point to where it hurt. Nolan added a second key hook by the kitchen door at the farm and asked if she wanted to choose paint for the back fence. She looked at the hook, then at him. "White gets dirty." "Most things do. Maybe pale green," she said. "Something forgiving." The next morning, rain passed before breakfast, leaving the world soft and bright. Nolan worked on the porch rail. Tessa fed Moss and Lark near the kitchen steps. Pruitt stood at the fence, complaining that Lark looked at him like a man behind on taxes, while Moss guarded an empty bowl with the gravity of a courthouse. No one there was fully healed. But the old house had light again, the grandfather's farm had footsteps, and Nolan finally understood that letting someone new enter his life did not betray the woman he had lost. It only meant he was still alive. What I keep coming back to is the second key hook by the door. Not the break-in, not the old grief, not even the moment Nolan opened the curtains in the house he had avoided for so long. Just that small hook, waiting beside the first one, saying without a speech that someone had been given room to stay. The people in this story are imagined, but the ache behind them is not. Plenty of us know what it means to avoid a room, a road, a photograph, or a name, because it still carries too much. And plenty of us have been helped back to life by ordinary mercy. A clean towel, a warm kitchen, a steady hand, a small creature trusting us before we trust ourselves. I hope you'll share in the comments whatever this brought to mind for you. A memory, a prayer, a person you miss, or a kindness that arrived when you needed it most. If these grounded stories mean something to you, a like and subscribe truly helps keep them going. May God bless you with a quiet place to rest, someone who notices when you are tired, and enough grace to open the curtains when the morning comes. And somewhere after the rain, Moss and Lark are probably still guarding an empty bowl like it matters.